The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the afternoon air made Patricia freeze mid-sentence. She had been standing over me, clipboard in hand, gloating about how she had finally taught my family a lesson about respecting her authority. My 5-year-old daughter Emma was still locked inside the concrete control shed behind her, crying and banging on the metal door. Patricia looked up at the sky and laughed dismissively. "Just more military training nonsense," she said, waving her hand like she was shooing away a fly. "They have no authority in my community." I checked my watch. Exactly 3 minutes had passed since I made the call. The rotor wash from 2 Black Hawk helicopters began sending Patricia's precious papers flying through the air like confetti. Her confident smile started to crack as she realized this was not just another training exercise. That was the moment Patricia Whitman learned the difference between fake neighborhood authority and real military power. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I never thought living in Willowbrook Estates would become my personal battlefield. After serving 8 years as an Army sergeant, I thought I had left conflict behind. I was wrong. Sometimes the most vicious enemies wear cardigans and carry clipboards instead of weapons. I moved to this upscale HOA community 3 years ago with my wife Sarah and our daughter Emma. The neighborhood looked perfect on paper. Manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, a playground where children could play safely. What the real estate agent did not mention was Patricia Whitman, the HOA president who ruled our little suburb like a dictator. Patricia was everything you imagine when you hear the word Karen. Blonde hair always perfectly styled, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people make in a month, and an attitude that suggested the world existed solely to serve her needs. She had been HOA president for 6 years, and in that time, she had transformed what should have been a peaceful community into her personal kingdom of petty tyranny. The harassment started small, as it always does with people like Patricia. First, it was a citation because Emma left her bicycle on our front lawn overnight. Then came complaints about our mailbox being 2 inches too far from the curb. She measured our grass with an actual ruler and issued fines when it exceeded the HOA-approved height by a 1/4 inch. Every weekend, Patricia would patrol the neighborhood with her clipboard, hunting for violations like a predator stalking prey. She had recruited a small army of equally miserable neighbors to serve as her informants, people who apparently had nothing better to do than peer through curtains and report their neighbors for imaginary infractions. The community control shed sat at the center of our neighborhood like a concrete fortress. Patricia had convinced the HOA board to build it 3 years ago, claiming they needed secure storage for maintenance equipment and a private space for board meetings. In reality, it had become her personal command center, where she held court and planned her next campaigns against families who dared to live their lives without seeking her approval. After leaving the military, I had taken a job with Tactical Logistics Solutions, a private company that coordinates equipment and personnel for military training exercises. It was good work that let me use my organizational skills while staying connected to the military community I loved. Most importantly, it kept me close to home so I could be the father Emma deserved. My colleagues often joked that dealing with HOA politics was harder than military operations, and they were not wrong. In the Army, everyone understood the chain of command and the mission. In suburbia, petty dictators like Patricia created chaos for sport. That Saturday morning started like any other weekend. Sarah was visiting her mother in the next state, and I had planned a quiet day at home with Emma. We were going to work in the garden, maybe visit the playground, just enjoy being together. Then my phone rang with an emergency call from work. One of our major training exercises had equipment problems, and they needed someone to coordinate emergency replacements immediately. It was the kind of call you cannot ignore, especially when active duty soldiers are depending on you to do your job right. I called our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always been kind to Emma. She agreed to watch my daughter for a couple of hours while I handled the crisis. Mrs. Rodriguez was one of the few neighbors who had not been intimidated by Patricia's reign of terror, and I trusted her completely with Emma. As I gathered my work materials and kissed Emma goodbye, I noticed Patricia watching from her living room window. She always seemed to know when people were vulnerable, when they had to leave their homes undefended. I should have recognized the look in her eyes, the way a predator watches wounded prey. But I was focused on my work emergency, and I believed Emma would be safe playing in our neighborhood with Mrs. Rodriguez nearby. I had no idea that Patricia had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. I had been gone for barely 30 minutes when Patricia made her move. Later, Mrs. Rodriguez would tell me exactly how it happened, her voice shaking with rage and disbelief at what she had witnessed. Emma had been playing with her favorite red ball in our front yard, bouncing it against the garage door the way 5-year-old children do when they are happy and carefree. The ball got away from her and rolled toward the community playground, stopping near the control shed where Patricia stored her kingdom's tools of oppression. Mrs. Rodriguez was weeding her flower garden, keeping one eye on Emma while working. She told me she saw Patricia emerge from her house like a spider sensing prey in her web. Patricia had been watching and waiting, and the moment Emma chased her ball near the shed, she struck. "Emma, stop right there," Patricia commanded, marching across the common area with her clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. "You are trespassing on HOA property." Emma looked up with confused 5-year-old eyes. She had played in this area dozens of times. Every child in the neighborhood used the common spaces. That was the whole point of living in a community. "I am just getting my ball," Emma said in her sweet, innocent voice that usually melted adult hearts. But Patricia's heart had been frozen solid years ago by bitterness and the intoxicating drug of petty power. "Your family has violated HOA regulations repeatedly," Patricia announced, as if she were delivering a legal judgment instead of harassing a kindergartner. "Your father thinks military service makes him special, but in my community, everyone follows the same rules." Mrs. Rodriguez dropped her gardening tools and started walking toward them, but Patricia moved faster than anyone expected. She grabbed Emma's arm and began dragging her toward the control shed, ignoring the child's frightened protests. "Let me go," Emma cried, trying to pull away from Patricia's grip. "I want my daddy." "Your daddy is not here to protect you now," Patricia said with the kind of cold satisfaction that reveals someone's true nature. "Maybe spending some time thinking about respect will teach your whole family a lesson." Mrs. Rodriguez began running toward them, shouting for Patricia to stop, but the HOA president had already reached the shed. She produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the heavy metal door. The inside was dark and windowless, filled with lawn equipment and maintenance supplies. It was no place for a child. "Please do not do this," Mrs. Rodriguez begged, arriving just as Patricia shoved Emma inside the shed. "She is just a baby." "She is a 5-year-old who needs to learn that actions have consequences," Patricia replied, slamming the door shut and turning the lock. Emma's muffled cries immediately began echoing from inside the concrete walls. "You cannot lock up someone else's child," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice rising with panic and disbelief. "This is kidnapping." Patricia straightened her cardigan and consulted her clipboard as if checking off items on a grocery list. I am exercising my authority as HOA president to address repeated violations by the Thompson family. The child will be released when her father returns and agrees to follow community standards. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately called 911, but Patricia laughed and showed her a folder full of legal documents. I have consulted with our HOA attorney, she announced proudly. Everything I am doing is within my rights as president of this community. The 911 operator seemed confused by the situation and said they would send someone when they could, but it was not considered an emergency since no one was in immediate physical danger. Mrs. Rodriguez then called me, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened. I was 40 minutes away in traffic when I got the call. The moment Mrs. Rodriguez said Patricia had locked Emma in the shed, my blood turned to ice. Every protective instinct I had developed as a father and a soldier screamed at me to move faster, to get home now, to make this nightmare stop. But first I made another call, one that would change everything. The drive home felt like the longest 40 minutes of my life. Mrs. Rodriguez stayed on the phone with me, providing updates that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Patricia had positioned herself in front of the control shed like a prison guard, refusing to let anyone near the door. Emma's cries had grown weaker, and Mrs. Rodriguez was terrified about the air quality inside that windowless concrete box. She keeps saying she has legal authority, Mrs. Rodriguez told me, her voice thick with anger and helplessness. She has all these papers, and she keeps waving them around like they give her the right to torture a child. I could hear other neighbors gathering, their voices rising in protest, but no one seemed willing to physically confront Patricia. She had spent years training them to fear her authority, to believe she had powers that existed only in her twisted imagination. "Has anyone else called the police?" I asked, weaving through traffic while trying to stay calm. "3 families have called, but they keep saying it is a civil matter since she claims HOA authority. They said someone will come when they can, but it could be hours." Hours? My 5-year-old daughter was locked in a hot, dark shed, and the people paid to protect our community were treating it like a property dispute. That was when I realized the system had failed us completely. Sometimes justice requires going outside normal channels. I pulled over and made the most important phone call of my life. "Colonel Thompson speaking." "Tank, it is Marcus. I need help and I need it now." Colonel Michael Thompson had been my commanding officer during my last 2 years of active duty. After I got out, he had helped me get my job with tactical logistics solutions. We had stayed in touch, and I knew he was now running regional training operations out of Fort Benning. More importantly, I knew he was a father who would understand exactly what I was facing. "What is the situation, Marcus?" I explained everything as quickly as possible while speeding toward home. Patricia's escalating harassment, the locked shed, the failure of local authorities to take it seriously. By the time I finished, Tank's voice had taken on the cold, controlled tone I remembered from combat briefings. "You said this woman locked your 5-year-old daughter in a concrete shed and is refusing to release her." "Yes, sir, for over an hour now." "That is kidnapping and child endangerment. I do not care what kind of HOA paperwork she thinks gives her authority. The local police are treating it like a civil dispute." There was a long pause before Tank spoke again. "Marcus, do you remember the urban rescue training protocols we used to run?" "Of course. We have a full helicopter training exercise scheduled for 1,500 hours today, about 20 minutes from your location. Urban rescue simulation with full tactical response team. Sometimes these exercises need to respond to real-world emergencies for additional training value. My heart began pounding with hope for the first time since Mrs. Rodriguez's call. Tank, I cannot ask you to do that. You are not asking. I am telling you that if there is a child in danger, my teams need realistic training scenarios. Keep that shed in sight, maintain safe distance, and help will arrive in exactly 3 minutes after I give the go signal. How will I know when to expect you? You will know. I arrived home to find the nightmare in full swing. Patricia stood guard in front of the control shed like some suburban warden, still clutching her clipboard and legal documents. A crowd of neighbors had gathered, but they maintained a respectful distance, conditioned by years of fear to avoid direct confrontation with their HOA dictator. Emma's voice was barely audible now, just weak crying that broke my heart with every sound. I wanted to charge across that common area and tear the door off its hinges, but Tank had been clear about maintaining distance. Military operations require discipline, even when your child is the one being rescued. Mr. Thompson, Patricia called out when she saw me approaching. Perfect timing. Now we can discuss your family's ongoing violations and what it will take to secure your daughter's release. The casual way she said it, like Emma was a bargaining chip in some twisted negotiation, made me see red. But I forced myself to stay calm and check my watch. Tank had promised 3 minutes, and military time was always exact. Patricia, let my daughter out of that shed right now. Not until you agree to follow community standards and pay the accumulated fines for your various violations. I looked at my watch again, 2 minutes. To understand what happened next, you need to know about my job with Tactical Logistics Solutions and my relationship with Colonel Michael Thompson. When I left active duty, I thought I was leaving the military behind, but some bonds never break. Tank and I had served together during some of the most challenging operations of our careers. He was the kind of leader who never left anyone behind, who would move heaven and earth to protect his people. After I got out, he had personally recommended me for my current position, knowing that my organizational skills and military connections would make me valuable to the private contractors who support military training operations. My job involved coordinating equipment, personnel, and logistics for training exercises across the Southeast. I worked with active duty units, National Guard and reserves, helping them get the resources they needed for realistic training scenarios. It was rewarding work that kept me connected to the military community while allowing me to be home with my family. Tank had risen through the ranks to become a full colonel, now responsible for regional training operations that involved thousands of personnel and millions of dollars in equipment. He was based at Fort Benning, but his units operated training exercises throughout Georgia, Alabama, and surrounding states. When I called him about Emma, I was not just reaching out to an old friend. I was contacting someone who had the authority and resources to respond to genuine emergencies, especially when civilian authorities were failing to protect a child. Marcus, I need you to understand something, Tank had said during our call. What this woman is doing is not just morally wrong, it is criminally wrong. Unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, possibly kidnapping. If local authorities are not taking it seriously, then we have a duty to respond. The training exercise he mentioned was real. Urban rescue operations were a standard part of military training, designed to prepare soldiers for responding to disasters, hostage situations, and civilian emergencies. These exercises happened regularly, and they often involved helicopters, tactical teams, and coordination with local authorities. The beautiful thing about training exercises. Tank had explained with grim satisfaction, is that they can be modified in real time to address actual emergencies. My teams need practice responding to child endangerment situations, and your neighborhood just became the perfect training ground. Now, standing in front of Patricia while she held my daughter hostage, I understood the genius of Tank's approach. This was not some cowboy operation or abuse of military authority. This was a legitimate training exercise that happened to address a real emergency that local authorities were ignoring. Patricia continued her power trip, apparently believing she had won some kind of victory. She had attracted a crowd of neighbors, some supportive but most just watching in horrified fascination. Mrs. Rodriguez stood near me, tears streaming down her face as Emma's weak cries continued from inside the shed. "Your daughter will be released when you agree to my terms," Patricia announced, consulting her clipboard like she was reading from a legal brief. "First, you will pay all outstanding fines for HOA violations. Second, you will sign an agreement acknowledging my authority as HOA president. Third, you will publicly apologize to the community for your family's disrespectful behavior." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Even Patricia's usual supporters seemed uncomfortable with her demands. This had gone far beyond HOA enforcement into something darker and more personal. "Patricia, you cannot hold a child hostage over HOA fines," said Mr. Chen, one of the more reasonable board members. "This has gone too far." "I have full legal authority," Patricia snapped, waving her folder of documents. "Our HOA attorney has confirmed that I can take necessary steps to enforce community standards." I seriously doubted that any legitimate attorney had authorized locking children in sheds, but Patricia seemed to believe her own fantasy. Power had corrupted her completely, and she genuinely thought her manufactured authority gave her the right to terrorize families. "You have 30 seconds to decide," she told me, checking her expensive watch. "After that, your daughter stays in the shed until you learn respect." I looked at my own watch. Tank's 3 minutes were almost up. That was when we heard the first distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the afternoon air. Patricia glanced up dismissively, then returned her attention to me. "Just more military training nonsense," she said with the confidence of someone who had never encountered real authority. "They have no power in my community." The sound grew louder, much louder. I smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. "Patricia, you are about to learn the difference between fake authority and real authority." The first Black Hawk helicopter appeared over the tree line like something from an action movie. Patricia's confident smile faltered as the aircraft came into full view, its rotors creating a thunderous noise that drowned out all conversation. A second helicopter followed immediately behind it, both aircraft circling our neighborhood in a tight tactical formation that left no doubt about their intentions. "What is happening?" Patricia shouted over the rotor noise, her clipboard pressed against her chest as papers began flying from her folder. The downdraft from the helicopters was strong enough to send lawn chairs tumbling and scatter her precious HOA documents across the common area like confetti. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the confrontation began backing away, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly about to become the most dramatic event in Willowbrook Estates history. Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with amazement and hope. "Marcus, did you do this?" I nodded, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. Sometimes you have to call in bigger authority. The lead helicopter began its descent, landing in the common area about 50 yards from the control shed. Before the rotors had even stopped spinning, armed soldiers in full tactical gear began emerging from the aircraft. They moved with the precision and purpose that comes from years of training, establishing a secure perimeter around the area. Patricia stood frozen in place, still clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of shield against the military force now surrounding her. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as she tried to process what was happening to her carefully controlled little kingdom. Colonel Michael Thompson emerged from the lead helicopter, and I felt a surge of pride and relief at seeing my old commanding officer in action. He was exactly as I remembered him: tall, imposing, completely calm under pressure, and radiating the kind of natural authority that Patricia could only dream of possessing. He walked directly toward us, flanked by two soldiers who carried themselves like the elite operators they were. Patricia took an involuntary step backward as Tank approached, finally coming face to face with real military authority. "Ma'am, I am Colonel Thompson with the United States Army," he said in the calm, professional tone that had commanded respect from everyone who served under him. "We are conducting an urban rescue training exercise in response to reports of child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment." "You cannot do this," Patricia sputtered, waving her clipboard at Tank like it was some kind of magic wand. "This is a private community. I am the HOA president and I have full authority here." Tank looked at her clipboard with the kind of polite interest you might show a child's crayon drawing. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from that structure immediately. We have reports of a minor being held against their will, and we are going to investigate." "She is not being held against her will," Patricia protested, her voice rising to near hysteria. "This is a legitimate HOA enforcement action. I have legal documents that give me the authority to discipline residents who violate community standards." "Ma'am, unlawful imprisonment is a felony regardless of what paperwork you think authorizes it," Tank replied, his voice remaining perfectly calm while Patricia became increasingly agitated. "Now please step aside so we can ensure the child's safety." Two of Tank's soldiers moved past Patricia toward the control shed, carrying equipment that looked designed for breaching locked doors. Emma's crying had grown weaker over the past hour, and I could see the genuine concern on their faces as they approached the structure. "You cannot just ignore my authority," Patricia screamed, actually stepping toward Tank as if she planned to physically confront a career military officer. "I am in charge of this community. These people answer to me." That was when Tank's expression changed. The polite professionalism remained, but something harder and more dangerous appeared in his eyes. He had dealt with dictators and bullies in war zones around the world, and suburban HOA tyrants were just another variety of the same species. "Ma'am, the only authority I recognize is the safety and welfare of children," he said, his voice dropping to the level that had once made enemy combatants surrender without firing a shot. "That little girl has been locked in a windowless concrete structure for over an hour. If you continue to interfere with our rescue operation, you will be detained." The word "detained" seemed to finally break through Patricia's delusion. She looked around at the armed soldiers, the helicopters, the crowd of neighbors recording everything on their phones, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. The soldiers at the shed had the door open in less than 30 seconds. Emma emerged blinking and crying, reaching immediately for me as I ran toward her. She was scared and overheated, but alive and unharmed. Tank's medical specialist began checking her immediately while I held her close, feeling like my heart might explode with relief and gratitude. Patricia stood alone in the middle of the common area, surrounded by the scattered papers from her clipboard, watching her kingdom of petty tyranny crumble in real time. The transformation in our neighborhood was immediate and complete. Within minutes, Patricia went from untouchable HOA dictator to just another middle-aged woman who had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The helicopters, the soldiers, the dramatic rescue of my daughter had shattered the illusion of her authority like glass. Emma clung to me while Tank's medic checked her vital signs and gave her water. She was dehydrated and frightened, but physically unharmed. The medic recommended a hospital evaluation as a precaution, and I agreed immediately. Every aspect of this incident needed to be properly documented. "Daddy, I was so scared," Emma whispered against my chest. "The lady said you were not coming back." My blood boiled at Patricia's cruelty, but I forced myself to stay calm for Emma's sake. "I will always come back for you, sweetheart. Always." Meanwhile, Patricia was discovering that her legal documents meant nothing to people with real authority. Tank had called local law enforcement during the helicopter approach, and 2 police cars were now pulling into the neighborhood. The officers who emerged looked far more serious than the ones who had dismissed Mrs. Rodriguez's earlier calls. "Ma'am, you need to understand that what you did constitutes multiple felonies," Tank was explaining to Patricia with the patience of someone who had dealt with far more dangerous criminals. "Child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, possibly kidnapping depending on how the prosecutor wants to charge it." "But I have HOA authority," Patricia kept repeating, like a broken record stuck on the same phrase. "My attorney said I could take enforcement actions." "Your attorney did not authorize you to lock children in sheds," one of the police officers said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You are under arrest." The crowd of neighbors watched in stunned silence as Patricia Whitman, their feared HOA president, was read her rights and placed in the back of a police car. Several people were recording with their phones, and I knew this would be all over social media within hours. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying with relief and rage. "I cannot believe she actually did this to a baby," she kept saying. "What kind of person locks up someone else's child?" "The kind of person who has been drunk on petty power for so long that they lose all connection to basic human decency," I thought. But I kept that observation to myself. Tank approached me as the police car carrying Patricia drove away. "Marcus, how is Emma doing?" "She is going to be okay, thanks to you. Tank, I cannot thank you enough for what you did today." "You do not need to thank me. What that woman did was criminal, and someone needed to stop her. I am just glad we were able to respond quickly." "What happens to her now?" "That depends on the prosecutor, but child endangerment is serious business. She is looking at potential felony charges, which means prison time if convicted. Plus, I imagine her HOA position is finished." As if summoned by Tank's words, 3 other HOA board members arrived and immediately began damage control. They approached me with the kind of nervous deference that Patricia had never shown anyone. "Mr. Thompson, we are so sorry about what happened," said Mrs. Patterson, the vice president. "The board had no idea Patricia was planning anything like this. We want you to know that we will be calling an emergency meeting tonight to remove her from office. We are also going to implement new policies to make sure nothing like this ever happens again," added Mr. Chen. "Children should never be afraid in their own neighborhood." "What kind of policies?" I asked, still holding Emma close. "Oversight requirements for any enforcement actions, mandatory cooling-off periods for disputes, and an ombudsman system for residents who feel they are being harassed," Mrs. Patterson explained. "We realize now that we gave one person too much unchecked authority." It was exactly what Patricia should have feared most. Her abuse of power had not only destroyed her personally, It had also led to systemic changes that would prevent future HOA presidents from wielding the same kind of tyrannical control. The helicopters departed as dramatically as they had arrived, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed. Patricia's reign of terror was over, and everyone knew it. The social media videos were already going viral, turning her into a cautionary tale about what happens when petty authority meets actual consequences. That evening, Emma fell asleep in my arms while I read her favorite story. She would need some therapy to process what had happened, but children are resilient. She would recover and grow strong. Patricia, on the other hand, would be dealing with the consequences of her actions for years to come. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates had become a completely different place to live. Patricia Whitman was serving 18 months in county jail after pleading guilty to child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. Her husband had divorced her and moved away with their teenage son, unable to handle the social stigma and legal bills. The HOA board had implemented every reform they promised and more. The new president, Mrs. Patterson, focused on community building rather than punishment. The monthly board meetings actually addressed maintenance issues and neighborhood improvements instead of serving as Patricia's personal court for imaginary violations. Emma had recovered beautifully with the help of a child therapist who specialized in trauma. She played freely in our neighborhood again, though she always stayed close to home when I was working. The other children treated her like a hero, the little girl who had survived the mean HOA lady and brought the helicopters. My story had gone viral on social media, spawning dozens of copycat videos, and becoming a cautionary tale about unchecked authority in residential communities. I received messages from people around the country who had their own HOA horror stories, and many had used my experience as inspiration to fight back against their own petty dictators. Tank received a commendation from his commanding general for the creative use of training resources to protect a civilian child. The incident had become a case study in military schools about adapting training exercises to address real-world emergencies. "You know what I learned from all this?" I told Tank during one of our regular phone calls. "Sometimes the system fails good people, and when that happens, you have to find bigger systems with more authority." "That is exactly right," Tank replied. "Bullies only understand strength." Patricia spent years terrorizing families because no one had ever stood up to her with enough force to make her stop. The control shed still stood in the center of our neighborhood, but it had been converted into a community library where children could read books and play educational games. Emma loved spending time there, turning Patricia's symbol of oppression into a place of learning and joy. I often thought about what would have happened if I had not had military connections, if Tank had not been able to respond with such overwhelming force. Would Patricia still be terrorizing families? Would Emma still be having nightmares about being locked in dark places? The answer was probably yes, which is why I decided to share our story publicly. Too many people suffer in silence when faced with petty tyrants who abuse whatever small authority they have been given. Sometimes you have to escalate beyond local systems to find justice. Emma is 7 now, happy and confident and completely recovered from her ordeal. She knows that her daddy will always protect her, no matter what authority figures might try to hurt her. And Patricia Whitman learned that there is always a bigger authority waiting for those who abuse the power they have been given. Some lessons are learned the hard way.